Thanks. Well, good morning. Thank you, Merav, for the invitation. It's a privilege to be on the panel with my colleague, Shmuel, who's done some of the work for me. And I think the program as a whole is quite impressive, and I don't want to preempt things which will be said later by people who have perhaps more specialized expertise than I do. So what I'm going to do is attempt something a bit different. The remarks I'll make arise from work in progress devoted to the role of analogies in the making of U.S. Middle East policy. And the argument that I'll make very briefly this morning is that we've constructed an analogy to guide us on Iran. But far from guiding us, it is misleading us, and it's causing us to regard Iran as a virtual superpower in a way that intimidates us more than it intimidates the Iranians. The analogy, to anticipate my remarks, is between Iran and the Soviet Union. Now, let me take you back 30 years in time to March 1979, just after the triumph of Ayatollah Khomeini. He had just returned to Iran. A report in the Washington Post opened with these words, and I quote it: "In the lobby of the Intercontinental, the main tea-time occupation is comparative revolutions. Those who covered the Portuguese or Cuban revolutions argue over whether Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan is more a Suarez or a Castro. Those with a historical turn of mind seek parallels in the Russian Revolution, wondering if the Fedayeen will fill the role of the Bolsheviks. For those who fancy the French Revolution, there's the fun of identifying a future Napoleon from the ranks of obscure Iranian colonels." End of quote. From the very beginning, Americans sought to understand Iran's revolution through analogy. This mass movement, which was led by this wizened old man in a turban, was so foreign to American observers, and information on its workings was so thin that analogies widely served as substitutes for analysis. There's some literature, very interesting literature, on the ways that policymakers use and deploy historical analogies. At the risk of simplifying, it comes down to this: policymakers fall back on analogies most readily when information isn't clear enough to allow them to eliminate options, when time is very short, or when some current event stimulates the retrieval of a stored memory. And what's true for policymakers, of course, is just as true for journalists and pundits and others. Yes. Don't you have some Ayatollah preaching a sermon as you're... If these are the conditions in which analogies are invoked, certainly the case of Iran, I think, met all of the conditions. Now, as the quote suggests, the one I just brought, initially no one was sure which analogy to follow as the revolution in Iran unfolded. For Americans, the French Revolution was, of course, too remote. The Cuban Revolution seemed too small in scale, too much the work of a small junta to provide guidance about a revolution which, after all, brought thousands of people into the streets and overthrew a form of kingship which had existed in Iran really since time immemorial. But eventually, and with the help of the Academy, one analogy prevailed over the others. The Iranian Revolution would come to be regarded as a great revolution on the scale of the Russian Revolution. Now, I say with the help of the Academy because it was students of comparative revolution who singled out the Iranian Revolution from this jumble of third world turmoil as something different, of world historical significance. This may have had to do with their expectations of the revolution as it unfolded. Many of them, especially observers on the left, pinned very high hopes on a movement which dethroned America's puppet, the Shah of Iran, a movement that filled these broad avenues in Tehran. It filled the imaginations on college campuses. I was on a campus at that time. I remember it well. Of course, needless to say, the revolution quickly shed its leftist facade and revealed its true Islamic color, which wasn't red. but the academics had already bought in and had already made the analogy. Here was a revolution, they believed, which deserved a place in the pantheon of great revolutions. And it was a politically correct thing to do, to add at least some Muslims to the pantheon. In the 1980s, then, there grew up a considerable body of literature devoted to comparing Iran's revolution with the other great revolutions. Theda Skocpol, the Harvard political scientist, in 1979, published a very influential book comparing the French, the Russian, and the Chinese revolutions. And already in 1981, she quickly made a point of adding Iran. And this was her rationale, and I quote her. The Iranian Revolution has been so obviously mass-based and so thoroughly transformative of basic sociocultural and socioeconomic relationships in Iran that it surely fits more closely the pattern of great historical social revolutions than it does the rubric of simply a political revolution where only governmental institutions are transformed, end of quote. And on it went. In 1984, the Iran specialist and my old friend Marvin Zonis told a State Department session, and I'll quote, "The message from Iran is, in my opinion, the single most impressive political ideology proposed in the 20th century, since the Bolshevik Revolution. And if we accept that the Bolshevism is a remnant of the 19th century, then I argue that we've had only one good one in the 20th, and it's this one," end of quote. And here, for variety, is my teacher, Bernard Lewis. I quote him, "The Iranian Revolution was a real revolution in the sense that the French and Russian revolutions were real revolutions. It was a massive change in the country, a massive shift in power, socially, economically, and ideologically," end of quote. And then the journalists, of course, followed suit. From the right, here's David Price Jones. Khomeini's, quote, "seizure of power in 1979 has proved as consequential as the Bolshevik coup of 1917. And then on the left, Robin Wright wrote a book entitled The Last Great Revolution about Iran, which of course makes the identical argument even in the title. Now, I don't think I have time to explain in full why I think this categorization of Iran's revolution among the greats, so close to its occurrence, may have been premature. Compare France, Russia, and even China with Iran 30 years after their great revolutions. And they became, of course, military and economic superpowers. Iran clearly has not. But first impressions matter. And from a very early stage, Iran's revolution was deemed analogous to Russia's. America's foreign policy community, combining their long Soviet experience with a patent ignorance of Iran, then deliberately or unconsciously imposed a Cold War template on Iran. As a result, U.S. policy discourse on Iran has become suffused with Cold War analogies and reference. It began in earnest after 1991 when the Soviet Union fell, and its collapse became the model of how America could win without war, with lots of bows, of course, to George Kennan and containment. In 1993, both Iran and Iraq became subject to the policy of dual containment. Over time, of course, Iraq would be separated in U.S. thinking from Iran and subjected to another analogical template, which was Nazi Germany. But Iran seems to remain quite firmly embedded in America's Cold War template, despite Ahmadinejad's personal efforts to evoke Hitler. And this isn't the preference of only one side in the Iran debate. Cold War references are used by those who want the United States to take Iran as a serious challenge that needs to be confronted, and they're used by those who think the United States should take Iran as a serious challenge and therefore engage it. It's easiest to track this in journalism, so here are just a few examples. You might remember them. Tom Friedman, earlier this year in the New York Times, and I quote, "The next American president will inherit many foreign policy challenges, but surely one of the biggest will be the Cold War. Yes, the next president is going to be a Cold War president, but this Cold War is with Iran," end of quote. The headline of that piece was, in fact, "The New Cold War." And again, Robin Wright, in a Washington Post article entitled "U.S. versus Iran, Cold War II," and I quote, After 3 decades of festering tensions, the United States and Iran are now facing off in a full-fledged Cold War, end of quote, full-fledged, no less. And we don't know what's in the secret policy briefs, but the same kind of message has come across, I think, in very subtle ways in public statements by U.S. officials. I'll just give you a curious example. In beefing up the U.S. presence in Dubai to monitor the situation in Iran, Condoleezza Rice and Nicholas Burns both invoked Riga Station. This was Burns, and I quote him, "We sent a young kid from Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1926 out to Riga Station, George Kennan. We said, go and learn Russian. Sit in Riga. You be our window into the Soviet Union. That is what we're saying to these young kids today. You go to Dubai. We can't be in Iran. You interview every Iranian you can find. You get to know them, all the Iranians who come out there to do their banking and their weekends there, and you tell us how we should understand Iran," end of quote. And had I more time, I could regale you with similar snippets, which I would label under the category of Sovietological displacement. Now, the Soviet-Iran analogy has been extended, of course, to Iran's regional role, which is the subject of this conference, its role vis-a-vis the so-called proxies, which is also, by the way, Cold War referent, Hezbollah and Hamas. Now, during the Cold War, the fear was that the Soviets would do in the Middle East what they had done in Eastern Europe, operating through proxies and exploiting chaos. They would establish a sphere of influence all the way down to the Persian Gulf. And the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as you will recall, was interpreted as the first move. Zbigniew Brzezinski called this the arc of crisis. You may remember the phrase. Time magazine, in a very famous cover story almost exactly 30 years ago, dubbed it the crescent of crisis. And it illustrated the cover of the magazine with a map of the Middle East, which was dominated by this looming, hungry Soviet bear. In this Cold War template, Iran is substituted for the Soviet Union, and Shiite crescent is substituted for the crescent or arc of crisis. This time it's Iran, which is already on the waters of the Gulf, that's seeking to establish itself on all sides of the Gulf, as well as on the Mediterranean. Now, as we'll hear today, we've already heard this morning, Iran is certainly attempting to do this. The problem with the analogy is that it presumes Iran has the kind of superpower clout that the Soviet Union had, even though Iran can't invade countries or sell top-of-the-line weapons systems or rattle, at this point, a nuclear saber. And this brings me really to the key problem with the Cold War analogy. It hides Iran's weakness. And in doing so, it tilts the U.S. approach to Iran away from prevention, possibly preemption, and toward containment and deterrence, away from confrontation and thus towards engagement. It thus works paradoxically as a self-fulfilling analogy. Thanks to its hold on our imaginations, the United States is already in the process of resigning ourselves to the continued growth of Iranian power until eventually it does more closely resemble a major power in its capabilities. This really would allow Iran to create Cold War-style crises and wage genuine proxy wars. By prematurely promoting Iran from the status of a third world upstart to a major power and treating it as such, our policy elite has waged psychological warfare against ourselves. Now, many of those who do this cite George Kennan as their hero. But for Kennan, a state like Iran couldn't possibly rise to the level of a power that had to be simply contained. It could be dealt with at an entirely different level. And we know that because Kennan testified on Iran in 1980 before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. At the time, of course, Iran was holding hostages at the embassy in Tehran. And Kennan said that in face of what he called unprecedented insults by Iran, the Carter administration should go to Congress for a declaration of war. It should then seize and not just freeze, Iranian assets, and in turn, Iranian officials in the United States. He then added, and I quote him, "We should hold in readiness means of unilateral pressure on the Iranian regime, not excluding the military ones," end of quote. And I think Kennan would have found preposterous the notion that the United States might ever be locked in a Cold War with the likes of Iran, a state with about between 1% and 2% of the U.S. GDP and 1% and 2% of U.S. military expenditure. And there are people who have watched Iran up close and have reached the same conclusion. Last May, Ryan Crocker was asked this question in an interview. So is there a new Cold War comparable to that with the former Soviet Union between the U.S. and Iran? And Ambassador Crocker gave this answer, and I quote him, "I don't think so. The Soviet Union was a formidable force at its height, with a massive nuclear arsenal. It had half of Europe locked in its grasp. Iran simply does not carry anything remotely like that weight, not internationally, not even regionally," end of quote. So if this is so, then why do we demoralize ourselves and feed Iran's ambition with flattering analogies? The BBC recently reported all this Cold War II and containment talk in Washington, and then added this commentary, and I quote it, "How long Washington might wait over Iran is not at all clear. After all, it took 50 years for the Soviet Union to fall. The Cold War approach, though, could buy time for Western policymakers," end of quote. Well, in fact, the opposite is true. I mean, the Cold War approach buys time for Iran, which is why I think it's time to stop thinking analogically about Iran. And the alternative, friends and colleagues, is simple. It's to think logically. Thank you.